So we will continue on. And next up, we have a presentation by Glenn McGourty on the impact of fire on vineyards and wine grapes. And Glenn is a UC Cooperative Extension Viticulture Advisor Emeritus. So recently retired, but never fully retired. And Glenn has, in his career as a viticulture advisor, has covered Lake and Mendocino counties. So Glenn, thank you for making yourself available and coming out of retirement for this.
Sure, you bet, Morgan. Well, hello, everybody. So today's talk, we're going to talk about fire damage itself. What happens when a live fire goes in the vineyard, or you get heat from scorching winds, which can go in quite a ways depending on the fire event. Then we're going to talk about harvest following smoke. This is really a serious issue for the industry, especially this year. And what we want to know is the fruit smoke damaged? How do we minimize smoke flavors for white wines and for red wines? Next slide. So fire damage in the vineyards is when you get a live fire in, and the good news is that typically vineyards don't burn that easy unless you really have a hot day with a lot of wind. We find that small vineyards with brushy borders are the most at risk, and if you have dry cover crops or weeds, they're going to make it worse. So my advice to someone who's kind of in fire country is make sure that you mow really short or even clean cultivation. In some instances, the erosion is not going to be a problem. The damage you're going to get depends on the speed of the fire and the wind. So the hotter, the more wind, the more damage you get. We find often that fire will travel into the vineyard through a riparian area. If you have a little creek or something, or any brush that's in there, that's where it's likely to go. Next slide. So these vines are basically dead. I mean, they've been cooked. You can see that the drip tubing is melted. You had a live fire that got right into the vineyard, and it really smoked these vines. Next slide. Okay, so the fire went through quickly. In this case, the vines probably are okay because it was a fairly low going fire. It was very windy that day, but the fruit's probably no good. Next slide. So what we see when vines are damaged, I think that actually Kat talked about this, it's very similar to trees. It's usually seen on the margins of the vineyards. And when we have a vineyard firestorm that blows through the area with very hot winds, the vines may recover, but still have damage to the vascular system. So they might look like they're okay initially, but then later on, they just don't do very well. And like trees, it may take some time to see the damage. So we really want to do an inspection of the vine, see if the trunk and cordon vascular systems are okay. And if not, you might be able to rejuvenate it by heavy pruning right down to the graft union if the tissue there is healthy. It just depends. But usually, once you have a compromised vine, you're in trouble. Next slide. So here's an example of where very, very hot winds and a low burning fire. You can see the vines are pushing at the tips, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to survive. It's a good sign if you see green growth, but you really have to wait until next year to be sure. And we usually do inspection of the vascular system too to find out what's going on. Next slide. So close inspection, cut into the vascular system in multiple places and see if the tissue is still green and turgid, meaning does it look healthy to you? You may need a hand lens or a microscope, but look for grayish discoloration or browning of the vascular tissue. Cut into buds on shoots to see if they're green, and if things look okay, re-inspect the following spring. So as far as re-irrigation goes and stuff, you know, you don't necessarily want to push a lot of growth at the end of the season, but if things are really dry, I would do some irrigation because you could also end up with frost or freezing damage in the winter as well if things are really dry. Next slide. You know, Kat said something really wise, which is basically you can't tell a lot of difference sometimes between freeze damage and heat damage. And this actually is from the Lake Erie region showing frost damage on vascular tissues, and looks very similar. On the right, you have a healthy looking wood, and on the left, you have dead wood. And in between, you have gradations. And if you look at sample D, you can see streaking in the vascular system. That's usually an indication that you've got problems. Next slide. So that's basically vineyards. You can do an assessment fairly quickly. As I said, it's usually the margins around a vineyard that have problems, and you know, the same thing applies as Kat said with trees. You can apply to FSA for maybe replant money. But now we're going to talk about smoke. since we seem to have lots of it these days. So smoke can travel hundreds of miles, but usually settles near the fire in low areas when the wind isn't blowing. There's various components. There's visible airborne products of combustion, including tar, ash, carbon, and partially burned fuel fragments. But probably more damaging to us in the vineyard industry are these many gases that are coming off of a fresh fire. And you can see we have everything from carbon dioxide to ammonia and methane and carbon monoxide. The particulates themselves only make up about 1.5 to 2% of the material that's burned. Next slide. So what are your risks for smoke damage? Fresh smoke is really what you're worried about. So when smoke inundates your vineyard near a rapidly burning fire accompanied with considerable heat, as when it's blown into or rises through your vineyard, such as when you're on a hillside and the fire is below, that's when you're going to have problems. Old smoke, like we're getting from some distance, and in our case, we're getting a lot of smoke right now out of Mendocino National Forest, and it's 30 or 40 miles away. And it makes our lives miserable, but it probably won't affect the fruit. It's the fresh smoke that's the problem because it's got all the volatile gases. Old smoke is mostly suspended particulates. Next slide. I've had personal experience with this. This happened right across the street from where we were in 2018, and at that time, that was the largest fire in California. Since that time, we're just eclipsing that amazingly this year. Next slide. These are satellite images, and July 28th on the left, you can see where the fire is starting, and then August 4th, you can see where it's burning. And I actually did a research study with Mike Jones and some other people to take a look at the impacts of smoke to try to figure out which vineyards got smoked and which ones didn't. The little red spots you see are actually actively burning fires. Next slide. So just to explain this, here we see vineyards burning, and on the picture on the left, there's smoke that's kind of headed for this vineyard, and the fire is headed for this vineyard. It's probably going to have some severe damage. The picture on the right, you can see where the smoke is blowing through. We've got pretty good wind, and there's actually a vineyard in that area, and the cloud kind of in the upper left-hand portion of the screen. And that vineyard certainly is going to have smoke damage. On the other hand, the vineyard down below, if the wind direction doesn't change and it doesn't burn so there's blowing smoke across it, it might be perfectly okay. Next slide. So what happens? Well, lignan's the source of the phenolic compounds, and that makes up about 20 to 30% of the mass of a tree. And lignin primarily lines the vascular systems. There's two compounds that we watch really closely. It's Guaiacol and 4-methyl Guaiacol. They're volatile phenols associated with smoke flavors in food. They also are in toasted oak barrels. It's a good indicator for smoke damage, and we have rapid commercial lab analysis most of the time. This year, there's so many samples, the labs are simply inundated. They can't respond quick enough. What we need to understand is that Guaiacol is not the only compound involved. There's about 70 other phenolic compounds that have off flavors and described as licking an ashtray, burnt garbage, burnt potato, campfire drenched with water. That's not so good. Guaiacol is associated with bacon, and if all smoked wine tasted like bacon, it would probably sell more of it, but it doesn't. It gets into some of the other flavors, and that's where we have a problem. Next slide. So as you can see in the top, we have a fire, the grapes are ripening, and we end up with smoke flavors in the bottle. And why is this? Because there's the grapevine has enzymes in it that normally what it does is it's catching an antioxidant called resveratrol, which some of you may have heard of before. And it's a naturally occurring compound in the grape that has a benzene ring and a hydroxyl radical on it. And it binds it with sugar, and that helps the plant get through harvest without any mold or bacteria issues. So to the vine, it sees all of these smoke compounds as looking very similar, and it binds them in there, and then we end up with smoke problems. Next slide. And there's the structure of Guaiacol and 4-methyl Guaiacol. They look a lot like resveratrol. Next slide. So where are these smoke flavored compounds in the grapes? Well, they accumulate in the skins rather than the pulp and the juice. So that's the key. The skins are where you're going to find them. So we test the fruit before picking to see if those smoke compounds are there. And if we find anything more than about half a part per billion guaiacol, you might have smoke problems. Guaiacol may not be giving the bad flavor, but it's highly correlated with all the other volatile phenols that are likely to get in there that cause the off flavors. And if we get fruit with more than 5 parts per billion guaiacol, it's not worth picking. And wineries just simply can't make good wine out of it because it's going to taste bad. Next slide. So if you're going to check your vineyard after smoke damage, berry sampling is a good way to do it if you can get it to a lab. So we'd pick about a pound of fruit, we place it in a plastic Ziploc bag and keep it cool, and bring it to a lab that's capable of analyzing guaiacol and forming guaiacol. The results are normally in 1 to 2 days, but there's so much smoke going on this year, it's more like about 6 or 7 weeks. It's expensive. It's about $150 to $250 per sample, but it's definite. Next slide. So the other thing you can do is make microfermentations, is basically small batches of wine. You can go anywhere from a quart to 5 gallons. You take a representative sample from the block you're checking. It's 7 to 10 days to ferment. It's very affordable, and it's good for testing multiple blocks. Then you can taste the wine itself and have it analyzed for guaiacol and figure out if you're smoke tainted or not. It's very obvious. It's a really good way to go if you have the time. So in the case of the Lake County fire, we had the fire in August and early September. We didn't harvest till late September, so it gave us plenty of time to check to see if there were issues with individual blocks. Next slide. There's a very high correlation between what we find in the berries and what we find in wine. Basically, when yeast uncouples these various phenolic compounds, the smoke taint quality goes up. So what we see here is that there's a correlation between the wine guaiacol and the berry guaiacol with an R-squared of 0.98, which is extraordinarily so it's very predictive. So if we know that we're getting a real good coefficient of oh boy, I'm kind of stumbling here a little bit. Anyway, it's highly correlated, and we know that it's a good number, so we can predict very accurately what we're finding in grapes versus what's going to be in wine. It basically increases 4 to 6-fold. Next slide. So we actually did some work in Lake County where we went through some vineyards that were exposed to smoke. Some wineries were saying it's all destroyed, and we didn't believe it, so we went out and did a test of about 14 different vineyards, and then we made microlots of wine and we tested them. We gave them a rating of 1 to 5, with 1 being we don't really detect anything, 3 is something was wrong, and 5 is awful. Next slide. Here we are set up for the tasting. So this is a blind tasting. We don't know what we're tasting exactly, but the wine looks perfectly good. It doesn't always smell good. Next slide. So here's a picture on the left is the fire when it was going on, looking down from outer space, and then on the right, the blue dots are where we sampled the vineyards, and you might notice that the vineyards that were most affected by smoke is the ones that are closest to the red outline, and that's where the actual fires were. So again, if you're in the path of smoke that's blowing through your vineyard that's fresh, you're probably going to have issues. Next slide. Here's how when we plotted them out, this is what they looked like in terms of the mean taste testing is the axis on the left, and on the bottom is the guaiacol content, ranging from barely detectable up to almost 35. Next slide. So what we found is that when we're below about 10 parts per billion in the wine, we really couldn't clearly discern the smoke taint. So low amounts of this compound are probably not a big issue. But as soon as we get above 10, next slide, then we're able to figure out something was wrong. And so we figured the likely taint threshold for most people is around 10 parts per billion. We're very sensitive to these smoke flavors. We can pick them out really well in our mouth. Next slide. So what do we do with the white fruit? Well, if we can, and the Guaiacol levels are fairly low if they're like under a part per billion. If we harvest when it's cool and we try to avoid breaking the skins, hand harvesting would be good. We separate the pressed fraction from the free juice when we're doing the pressing. So the harder you squeeze, the more you're going to get the bad stuff out. We'll take that pressed fraction and treat it with ultrafiltration or other techniques, and we can get the phenolics and discoloration out. We can blend it back, and then we can very effectively treat it. And so white wines, we have a little bit of an opportunity to fix because we don't have so much skin contact, and we just don't have as many phenolic compounds in the wine compared to red. Next slide. So red fruit's more of a problem because we have to have contact with skin to get the color out, and we find that our Guaiacol levels are going to go way, way up. And you definitely don't want to put it in toasted oak barrels since that also contains Guaiacol. It just makes it worse. Next slide. So how do they fix it? Well, they try reverse osmosis, but the problem with that is you're taking out other phenolics, so you tend to dilute the overall flavor of the wine, so it gets kind of more and more feeble. Some wineries just take a big loss and sell it in the bulk market for blending into a very big tank. And now wineries prefer not taking smoke-affected fruit. It's just too difficult to deal with between the expensive treatment and then trying to move it into the marketplace. Next slide. So the human factor is not everyone perceives smoky flavors the same way. So some people are very affected by it, especially winemakers. They get sensitized to it, and they get really stressed whenever they get near it. So on the other hand, white wines, we can clean those up fairly effectively, but red wines are much more of a challenge to fix if seriously tainted. Next slide. So that basically is what I have to tell you. I would just say that this research continues, and my advice to any grape grower who lives in fire country is that they should get crop insurance and not be afraid to make a claim. And I think this year especially, wineries are just being very picky because we've got a pretty good supply of wine in the tank. So there's going to be a lot of fruit kind of left in the vineyard. And by the way, it's okay. You don't have to pick it. It won't hurt the vines. If you just leave it there, the birds will eventually eat it. And when you prune, it will finish it all up. So that's what I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. There was one question, but I think you just answered it. The question was, if fruit is left unpicked, is there a benefit to future vine health in removing the fruit from the vine?
No need to. Don't spend the money.
All right, great. Well, thank you for all that information, and we'll all be looking for the good deals on smoky wine this fall or next year.